Well, I want to thank you all for the invitation to come, and of course, to thank you and the Purdue Libraries for the Library Scholars Grant that I received last year to work on this project entitled Friends and Allies, the Greek Military Junta and the United States. As the title indicates, the research that I did looks at, or the research I'm doing, looks at the foreign policy of the United States towards Greece during the military dictatorship that ruled Greece from 1967 to 1974. I've got a couple of pictures there from that period. This was essentially a very controversial, it has been a very controversial period ever since. In 1967, a group of colonels seized power in Greece, basically concerned that the left was gaining power there and was about to take over. Greece had been ruled since the Second World War by mostly conservative governments, and of course was a really important part of American foreign policy during the Cold War, in terms of kind of containing the southeastern flank of NATO and the southeastern flank of Europe. So when this group of colonels took over in 1967, they launched a dictatorship that would last for 7 years until 1974. And while that, of course, has now been over for, 40 years now, it's hard to believe it's been that long, this still remains a very controversial period, particularly the question of American complicity or American policy towards Greece during that period. It's a impression, it's a concern that affects Greek attitudes towards the United States to this very day. Essentially, to put it in a nutshell, the standard view of most people, particularly in Greece, is that the United States was behind the coup of 1967. That the CIA in particular was behind the coup, that the CIA had launched it, that it had done what it had done in the 1950s in Iran with the overthrow of Mossadegh, that it would later do in 1973 in Chile with Allende. And so the view is very widespread in Greece that the United States must have been behind the coup, and a large number of people outside of Greece as well, particularly on the left, believe that the United States must have been behind the coup. The problem is that there's never been any fully comprehensive account of this period, and certainly none that has been able ever to find that so-called smoking gun, that shows that that was the case. Interestingly, when we look at a country like Iran, we have the smoking gun. When we look at Allende in Chile, we have the smoking gun. The CIA documents have been released, we have them. We don't yet have them in Greece if they exist. And so what I've done, and this has been a project now that's been ongoing for quite a while, is I began really with research in the United States, going back 7, 8 years now. I basically looked at all the documents that I could find relating to U.S. foreign policy to Greece at 3 places: the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, the Johnson Presidential Library at the University of Texas in Austin, and the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. I've been to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland twice, and then I guess 2 summers ago now, in 2012, went to the Johnson and the Nixon libraries. And basically what I did was I collected as many documents as are now publicly available. Most of these come from the State Department, lots of cable traffic back and forth between the embassy in Athens and the State Department, some clearly from the Pentagon, some from the White House as well. The Johnson and the Nixon libraries were useful for that. Basically, trying to get a sense of what American foreign policy was. We're hampered, however, and I'll come back to this in a minute, we're hampered by the unavailability of the CIA documents and by the fact that some of the most interesting things, we think, have been removed from the archives. And that's a question that doesn't really relate to the Library Scholars Grant, but if you're interested, I could tell you more about it. As I was going through the documents in College Park in particular, it was very clear that after 9/11, a lot of interesting documents had been pulled because there were documents inserted in there indicating that documents had been removed. And of course, they have the dates of their removal, and they were suspiciously in 2002 and 2003 and during that period, showing again how sensitive this whole issue of Greece in 1967, 1968 still is. So that was kind of the background to this most recent round of research that I did. But I really thought that I'd like to get an external perspective. And the natural choice, I guess, for that would be the British archives. To what extent do we see in the British archives similar things that we're seeing in the American archives? And in a nutshell, what we're seeing in the American archives is that the United States did not see the coup coming, that there was a lot of concern that some kind of a coup might happen. There was a lot of talk about instability in Greece, and certainly there were lots of plots underway in different parts, particularly of the right wing of the political spectrum, were plotting and coming to the American embassy and trying to feel out the Americans as to whether or not they would support any kind of deviation from constitutional rule. But the embassy seems genuinely surprised on April 21st, 1967, when the coup actually takes place. So I wanted to see, is there any corroboration of this? Is there any verification of this in the British archives as well? Britain had historically been a very important force in Greece, going all the way back to Greek independence. You know, if you think of somebody like Lord Byron and the Philhellenes in Western Europe, tremendous interest in Greece, and basically all the way up until the late 1940s had been the predominant Western power in Greece. They were, of course, replaced in the late 1940s by the United States. So Britain has always had a traditional interest in that part of the world, and in Greece in particular. So that kind of justified, I think, my interest on the one hand. But maybe more importantly, the close relationship between Britain and the United States. You know, as perhaps our closest ally internationally, my hunch was that whatever the United States policy was, that would be reflected in the British documents as well. So the library scholars grant that I got was to conduct research here at the UK National Archives in London, in Kew. I conducted that research for a couple of weeks during my sabbatical in 2012, 2013. I went in June of 2013. You can see the archives there, and there's kind of unexciting picture of just outside the reading room where all these documents were held. During those weeks, I collected just under 10,000 pages of documents. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. Mostly from the Foreign Office, mostly involving, as I had collected in the United States, traffic between the Foreign Office in London and the embassy in Athens. Also Ministry of Defense documents between various agencies of the British government, the Prime Minister's office. There was a number of documents, I don't know how many exactly, I'd have to think about it, that came out of the Prime Minister's office, essentially detailing British policy towards Greece during this period. What I basically found, and I think in the end, going to the UK archives was really useful for a number of reasons. First, because it did what I hoped it would do. It really provided that alternative perspective. Because even though the United States and Britain are really close allies, their interests are not identical, their views are not identical, and the most fascinating documents were the ones in which the British diplomats are talking about their American colleagues. That's really the most interesting stuff. And I haven't gotten through all these documents, so I wish I could give you some nice, juicy example of that. But there would be times in which the British ambassador would report back to London about what the American ambassador was up to, which is always very interesting. Henry Tasker, what he's up to and what he's thinking. And occasionally there'd be little personal side notes thrown in that the British, in kind of their own certain way, are a lot of these documents were a lot more, I don't know what the word exactly would be, rather than being quite so cut and dried and bureaucratic and stuffy, some of them were beautiful examples of very interesting prose in which the Foreign Service officers just kind of went on about their own observations in very interesting, almost literary fashion. So it was, there were some really interesting examples of that. What I saw, I think, and I'm only now just working through these documents, so these are really preliminary conclusions, not even conclusions, but observations, is that the UK shared the same fundamental approach towards Greece as the United States, which was essentially, once the coup happened, the governments, like the United States or like the UK, regretted the deviation from democracy. As these documents continually say, as a matter of principle, our governments are committed to democracy. But, and there's the big but, this is in the context of the Cold War. And in the context of the Cold War, we have to deal with the government that we have. It's an anti-communist government. It's an allied government. It's a government ruled by the very military officers that we work closely with in NATO. And so while we may not like the situation, we're going to have to learn how to deal with it. We're going to have to see if we can use it to the best effect. And so the British government took a very similar attitude, as that of the United States. How do we work with this government? And so there was really, I guess you could say, as I look at both documents, the nice thing about these British documents is they really corroborate that story that was coming together in the American documents as well. You also clearly see that the United States was the lead actor, so to speak. The United States would take the lead. The British government, something I did not expect really, the British government would wait in many cases to see how the United States would respond to a particular situation or to a particular crisis, and then formulate their policy based on that. I wasn't expecting that kind of, approach. The second main thing, I guess I would say, that came out of it is clearly Britain had very specific interests there that the United States did not have. Arms sales was one, and the other was a very specific interest in the exiled king of Greece, King Constantine, who has close connections to the British royal family himself, is a relative of the British royal family, something that did not come out in American documents at all. Of course, Prince Philip himself, the Queen's husband, is Greek by birth, so there was that connection as well. In terms of difficulties in the research, the main difficulty I had was lots of documents, perhaps too many documents. I came back from my sabbatical with more documents than I left with, which actually I'm farther behind now than I was before my sabbatical, which is not a good thing, I don't think. But I'm not sure they're the best documents, and that raises the issue of the closed nature of the CIA documents. If you're a conspiracy theorist, you'll say that the smoking gun is in those documents you'll never get your hands on. And if there's a real conspiracy, then they're not even in the documents. And so, the challenge really is now to begin Freedom of Information requests on those documents, see what can come out of them. The ones I've done so far have come back so heavily redacted, you get nothing out of them. But I'm going to keep trying. So that was basically the research I did, and I think we have time for a few minutes if there are any questions.
What were you able to find when you were over in London, any MI6 documents that were British?
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, it's the same situation as the CIA. Those documents have not been opened. The British Archives has an excellent retrieval system, an excellent cataloging and retrieval system, better, in some ways more efficient than ours. The MI6 documents aren't in there at all. They're still closed, to the best of my knowledge. And the other issue is the Greek archives are closed as well. So yeah, that's kind of a natural thing to think about too. But no, it's the same situation. The intelligence documents seem to be all closed, at least at this point. And they're not subject, as to the best of my understanding, they're not subject to the same 30-year release requirements that the regular documents are. Well, that's the problem. The Greek archives have not been opened. And to give you an idea of how difficult that issue is, the Greek archives have not been opened even for the Greek Civil War, which was 47, 48, 49. So even going back that far, the documents haven't been opened. And the answer, I think there may be two reasons for that. The first is I'm not sure that they're in a state to be opened in terms of cataloging, in terms of, I can't imagine what they must look like. But the other thing is, I don't think they've been opened because they're so politically sensitive. The passions and the controversies and the divisions of the Civil War are still there, and if they're there from the late 1940s, they're definitely there for this period. And so I think it's almost a political issue too hot to handle, and so no, the Foreign Ministry archives, none of the ministry archives in Greece have been opened. That is another step. That would be Phillips Talbot and then Henry Taskin. No, I have not yet looked at their private papers. But yeah, that is definitely something I'd like to do at some point. Yeah.
I've heard that the British government immediately recognized as the de facto government after a revolution or whatever. Mm-hmm. Whereas the U.S. considers it as sort of an endowment of dignity to the government and is more hesitant to recognize. Did that come through in this as well?
Actually, what I discovered is that the British and the American approaches were fairly similar in the sense that actually the issue of recognition did not come up in the way you might think, because rather than having to resolve, I mean, the issue comes up, you see it in the documents, will we recognize this new military government? But they very quickly seize upon the fact that the United States ambassador and the British ambassador are accredited to the king. Therefore, they're accredited to the head of state. They're not accredited to the government of the day. And so therefore, even though there was this military takeover, the king was still on the throne. The king was still the head of state of the country. And so the issue of formal recognition of the regime actually never had to be dealt with. It was only much later, when the military dictatorship declared Greece a republic and deposed the king, that that issue came up. Then what do we do now? And the answer basically is, well, it's a fait accompli. I mean, if the king is gone, we're going to have to, we're going to have to recognize the current government. But for the first, what was it, 5-6 years, the issue of recognition was solved, you might say that way, by the fact that we formally recognized not the government of Greece, but the head of state, who was the king. And so that resolved the problem. And the British had the same basic thing. Their ambassador was accredited to the royal court, not to the government of the day. So the government of the day could do whatever it wanted, and the issue of recognition did not have to be resolved, because that was something that the opponents of the regime brought up, because there was a lot of protest and a lot of opposition to this regime in the United States and Western Europe. And they said, well, will you recognize the regime? And the standard response from the State Department or from the Foreign Office was, well, we don't have to, we're not recognizing any particular government of the day. We recognize the government of Greece as represented in the king. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your attention.